Okay, our next section, usually called the Middle East, which, when you think about it, one, it ain't the middle, and two, it ain't east. So, unless you're talking about London or Paris at that point, I suppose it is east. So the Middle East, on one hand, the words used, the phrase is used all the time. There's not really a good acceptance of exactly what region you're talking about. Most people are confused about it, which might make you feel a little bit better about map quiz. But it actually includes the area that would be basically West Asia, which is why we titled this section this thing. Includes West Asia and basically Northern Africa. Easiest way to think of this area is it's, again, you have to remember geography in the sense of what we teach was developed in this area here. And in the view of the Western Europeans, this was actually as much defined by religion as anything else. So when geography starts up as a modern discipline in the 16, 17, 1800s, this area was largely controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and it was Muslim. So this was, in many ways, this was actually defined as the area of Islam, was what the Middle East was. And actually, when you think about a lot of the stereotypes, even today in the media and stuff like that, sort of, Middle East equals Islam and further west is Christianity or something like that. Not accurate, but nonetheless, that's the way it's sort of played out. So this area isn't defined by what it is geographically. It's defined by the eye of the beholder that generated regional geography classes back, a couple hundred years ago. It was the area that the Europeans interacted the most with. The Ottoman Empire was a major power in the Eurasian, Western Eurasian area for a long time. So it was, it was a major player in what was going on. In fact, contemporary Turkey, as we'll see later, or Erdogan is really trying hard to make Turkey back into a major regional player. In the same way that Putin really wants Russia to be the, sort of resurging, become again the USSR superpower status. So what you, excuse me, what you get again is history. A lot of this area also, in terms of its relationship with Europe, is tied to Europe by virtue of the fact that during the Roman Empire, this whole area, basically the entire area surrounded that the Mediterranean touches, was all part of the Roman Empire. And that's probably a key part of the way it was perceived by Europeans. In some ways, you might think what they did is they knew more about this region because they had more interaction with it, both in the period of time, but also in the past with the Roman Empire, Greeks, etc., like that. And of course, it was also the foundation area of their religion. Judaism, Christianity starts up over here. Islam starts up actually here and slightly to the south. So, this was the area where the religions that permeated Europe, directly or indirectly, all came within, basically about 500 miles of each other. So in that context, that sort of defines this area. It's outside of Europe, but relevant to Europe. Further east was just like off the charts. And that's why it's called the Middle East. There's no such thing as like the West East or the Left East or something like that. The middle is this region. And to a lesser extent, because they were part of this, but not really, that also includes this section of Africa. And that's why this section is such a confusing area geographically, because it, on one hand, it includes parts of the western part of Asia, which would be here, but it also includes parts of the African continent. It's like, well, what do they have in common? Well, they actually have several things in common outside of the European perception of them as a package. One mentioned before, they're all heavily impacted by the growth of Islam in the 600 to 900 period. Almost all this area becomes Muslim and becomes under control of Islam, though not usually, most of it doesn't end up under control of one state per se. So there's no religious structure and the way that you have the Pope in charge of, Catholicism. So there's like one religious head. You have to remember in Islam, there's no such thing as a religious leader. There's imams who are in charge of particular congregations, but there's no one who speaks for Islam. There's no one that can say, this is this is what Muhammad meant, and this is what he didn't mean. So there's no equivalent to the Pope. There's no religious or church hierarchy. So these were political entities, and a fair chunk of it belonged to the Ottoman Empire for about 400 or 500 years, but they were religious entities. Secondly, is they're all bounded by the Mediterranean, with the exception maybe of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and stuff like that. So most of them are, at least some way, shape, or form, are interacting with the Mediterranean. And climatically, what they have in common is they're in an area that in the last couple of thousand years really doesn't get a lot of water. That wasn't the case in the past, but in the last couple of thousand years, it's an area that tends to be dry. So you don't get a lot of rainfall in this area. What you do get is occasional rainfall that occurs in mountain regions like here, or this part of Turkey, and then the rivers flow. So for much of this area, people depend on water from rivers. They don't depend on water from the sky. So they depend on river water, not air, not rainwater. And the classic stereotype, this would be Egypt, which is entirely dependent on the Nile River. Now, as we'll see, this has a lot of political ramifications because if you're at the top end of a river, for example, if you're Sudan and the river flows north into Egypt, you basically can put a dam up here and then cork that river. And if the Egyptians piss you off, you can just shut the dam, shut the water coming out of the dam down. And all of a sudden, in a couple of days, Egypt's got no water. And this is a very typical problem all throughout this region. Control of water and water resources is always been a major issue in this region. And control of water and water resources gave you power. And much of this region still gives you power even today in 2022. Just as a note, Egypt's thinking of going to war with Sudan because Sudan's putting in a big new dam which will control the Nile. And Egypt's already said, you guys do that. And that's basically a declaration of war because then we're going to be at your mercy and we can't allow that. And Sudan's sort of going like, well, tough. I'll live with it. So who knows that's going to play out. Doesn't get much press outside of the region, but in the region, everyone's looking at that. It's like, uh-oh. So this is an area that tends to be very dry unless you got water. If you got water, then you're in good shape. The only area that tends to be a little different than that is this coastal belt. And that's because of the Mediterranean. You have to remember the Mediterranean operates very much the way that we end up with the oceans around here. Moisture comes in off of the Mediterranean. And so your coastal zones in the Mediterranean tend to be, pretty decent in terms of amount of moisture they get. But that's because of the Mediterranean being there. It's not larger sort of global climatic conditions. Now, just as a note, this was not the case in the past. Up till about 400 AD, the large chunk of the jet stream, which is the 20 to 40,000 foot altitude movement of air, the Gulf Stream moving across this way, used to actually bring large amounts of moisture off the Atlantic and drop it down right through here. It generally missed poor old Egypt, but Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia, especially in the northern part, used to get a significant amount of rainfall. And they were tremendously powerful agricultural regions, with the extent that during the Roman Empire, a huge proportion of what people ate in terms of grains actually was shipped in from North Africa, which was all under control of the Romans. That's why the Romans took this area over, because it basically was their bread basket. This is where they got their food from. In this period, what happens is, and we're not really sure, but again, this was not a human triggered thing, it was a natural event. The Gulf Stream changed direction, or I should say the jet stream changed direction, shifted further north, and literally within a couple of years, this whole area started to experience massive drought. The rains quit showing up and they never came back. And this is one reason why if you go to this region, you can still find entire Roman cities, huge farming areas and everything that basically are just dried out. Because when the water quit showing up, everyone just had to pack up and leave because all of a sudden it wasn't there anymore. And this did have a major impact on one of the reasons for the collapse of the Roman Empire, is you no longer had food coming in, which suddenly meant that you had no way to feed your populations in the northern part, which were dependent on the food from the southern part. So in this case, global climatic change that's occurring by virtue of natural factors, which we don't really understand very well because we'd have to go back in time to see what triggered it. But the end result was it's just had massive impacts on this region, huge depopulation of large parts of the population, collapse of infrastructure, et cetera, as that suddenly disappears. And this Leptis Magna is a good example. If you want to Google that in, you can actually see that on Google Maps. You can actually see it if you go to Wikipedia. It's an example of these Roman cities, major, huge metropolises that were hugely powerful and very wealthy, shipping grain. And if you look around them now, they're in the desert. And it's like, what the hell? And that's because of these climatic changes that occurred. So this is a region in our time is basically dry. Rivers are how you survive. If you got a river, you're in good shape. You don't have a river, you're in terrible shape. So for example, the western part of Egypt, there's no river here. And if you notice, that's why I don't see any roads there. There's nothing going on because ain't no one there, except for a few Bedouin. So once that climatic change occurs, so for example, this region up here was actually quite wealthy under the Roman period and was solid farms for a couple hundred miles inland. The rain stopped showing up because of the jet stream changing direction, and poof, and that area has never come back in terms of being a power. Having said that, people still talk about, well, back in the Roman Empire, we were players, but that's, 2000 years ago. So this is a region where rivers become key. Now, if you remember when we're talking about Europe, rivers were key in terms of transportation, but you generally had enough rainfall. Most of your agriculture is rainfall based. In this region, it isn't. Most of your agriculture here is basically taking water out of rivers and canals and irrigation ditches, and that's how you do your agriculture. So if, for example, you're Turkey, a lot of the rivers in this region actually start out here in Turkey and then go down here, in both Euphrates and the Tigris, for example. So if you're Turkey and you start building a bunch of dams up here, that allows you to control all the water that Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, and to a certain extent, the western part of Iran have. So you don't actually have to go to war with them. If they just irritate you, just shut the dam off and watch the country dry up, because they don't get much rainfall. Almost everything they need to, whether it be drinking water, agriculture, etc., is coming from the rainfall and the snowfall that comes in your mountains up here to the north. And this is one of the big stress issues in this whole region is control of water resources. And in many ways, what I mean by this is control of other people's water. So if you're Syria, you better do what Turkey wants, or else Turkey's just going to make sure that you can't drink anything anymore. And this becomes a huge issue, and both in a major political, social factor. It's one of the reasons why Turkey's a major player in this region, is the water comes from Turkey. And that gives an enormous leverage in terms of dealing with their neighbors. That's someplace like Syria, Jordan, Israel, or Lebanon. They don't have that. They're at the other end. They're at the bottom end of the river system.